Today we're going to delve into the subject of gender and sexuality in Victorian America, and we're going to do so for several reasons. First of all, we want to understand better the lives of 19th century men and women. Also, we need to understand the predecessor for our own modern conceptions of gender and sexuality, and more than any other period, the Victorian era has really influenced modern America. And then lastly, in order to understand the reform movements that happen in the second half of the 1800s, as well as the movement for women's rights and the suffrage movement, you have to understand that within the context of gender and sexuality. Now, much of what we're going to discuss in this lecture is adult in nature, and it may not be something that you want to have playing in, say, if you're at Starbucks or if you have a younger brother or sister in the room with you while you're watching it. You may want to watch it privately. Let's start with a quick look at gender roles in the Victorian era and how they've changed since the colonial time period, as well as why it is that they began to change. So if you can remember all the way back to our lecture on sexuality in colonial America, we discussed early on about the myth of mutual orgasm and how scientists believe that in order for a woman to conceive a child, that both she and her husband needed to orgasm simultaneously. So by the time we get into the late 18th century, scientists at this point have discovered the role of the sperm and the egg in causing conception, and they've abandoned this previous myth. And so what they do is they take the role of the sperm and the egg, and they use this phenomenon to assign physiological differences to men and women. So they say that the egg is passive and it waits quietly, if you will, while the sperm are searching it out in order to impregnate the woman. And so according to this, they assign the difference that women should be passive and submissive to their husbands and to men in general, and that men are much more aggressive and bestial in nature, and that they should be in charge of society. So they're taking these observed differences and they are applying characteristics and traits to humans as a result. And it's at this point that a notion of separate spheres for both men and women really takes root in society. So women are part of the private sphere, and that means that they should be at home, child rearing, taking care of the house. If they're particularly wealthy, they'll be overseeing the servants or the slaves, and these women on plantations were known as keepers of the keys because they had the keys to all of the stores and the storage in the plantation. They might also be pursuing poetry and fanciful writing, learning to play the piano or some other instrument like the harp or the violin, cooking, and also learning a whole slew of domestic pursuits like sewing. And they're doing all of this, of course, while they're wearing a corset, and they're looking awesome, but they're probably not able to breathe very well because it moves around their internal organs and can actually cause death if worn for too long. Now, on the other hand, the men are in the public sphere, and they are responsible for the wage work. So they have the responsibility of being a breadwinner for the family, of going out into the world and working, and also of being a part of the political world. They are the ones who become the president, the vice president, the senators, the representatives. They're in charge of the government for the city and the towns that they live in. And in addition to all of that, the men are the ones who also have the availability to go out and seek entertainment. So they can go to sports clubs, and in the 19th century, boxing and bare-knuckle fighting was really popular. They might go to clubs and taverns, and also they're the ones who are responsible for becoming soldiers and doing military work. So there's a huge difference for men and women in these two spheres. And if women wanted to leave the house and go somewhere for entertainment, say to visit a friend, they needed a chaperone, a male chaperone typically, to do this. So over the course of early American history, we've seen a lot of changes in the evolution of family government. If you remember, we started with a patriarchy all the way up until the pre-Revolutionary War era. And this was a type of family in which the father and the husband had all of the control over his wife and his children, as well as over the slaves and servants. He was the unquestioned master of the home. Then as we moved into the Revolutionary era and all the way up until the 1820s, we shifted into a form of family government known as paternalism, where the father and the husband was still in charge of the household and he was still the master of the home, but he was supposed to have a sort of softened form of authority, where he was a benevolent leader and where he was ruling over these people because he cared about them and because he was just naturally the best suited to lead. And then that leads us into the Victorian era. All the way from the 1820s really up to the 1950s, we have what is known as a companionate marriage. And in a companionate marriage, they basically believe that both the husband and the wife have very important responsibilities in their marriage and in society. And theoretically, these responsibilities are separate but equal. And so women are responsible for all of these things in the private sphere, but also for being the moral backbone of their home and for providing the moral fiber of society. Now, you'll notice that with most things that are separate but equal, they're not quite so equal, because men in this equation have all of the power. They have the economic power, the social power, and the political power, and that's going to cause some problems within their marriages. At this point in history, men are being taught that they need to be faithful Protestant Christians, and they also are responsible for being the head of the household, which one would think is a tremendous amount of pressure, especially if they had servants or slaves working for them as well as a large family. They were supposed to be these industrious, hard workers who were able to provide for all of these different people, to clothe them, to feed them, and to keep shelter for them. But there was also this incredible double standard, a sexual double standard, in which men and women grew up with different understandings of sexuality and of different understandings of what was expected of them. And so while men were supposed to be Christian and they were supposed to be providing for and taking care of their wives and children, this double standard also acknowledged that men were naturally lustful and that they needed sexual gratification. And in fact, doctors in the 19th century told men that if they didn't have sexual intercourse, that it could be damaging to their health. And this was especially true for married men who had been opened to the possibility of sexual intercourse. If they were no longer being offered this, doctors thought it could quite literally kill them. And in some ways, you have to imagine that these two contrasting views of what it meant to be a man would lead to a crisis in masculinity, because how can one be a loving husband and also be a sexually aggressive beast on the other hand? And it's really going to lead to the rise of prostitution in the 19th century. Now, you can probably make some very keen parallels between manhood in the 19th century and manhood today, because while women certainly have lots of pressures put on them today, men have an equal amount of pressure, but in a much different form, where men are supposed to be upstanding gentlemen and oftentimes believe that they should be the breadwinner, and yet they're also supposed to fulfill this sexual double standard in order to prove their masculinity to other men often. We can also see an evolution in the various stereotypes about women and their character. If you remember, again, back to that lecture on women and sexuality in early America, we learned about that wanton seductress stereotype in which women were given the characteristics of Eve, who was a seductress and who was responsible for the fall of mankind. And this characterization lasted all the way up until the 1770s, after which women really proved their worth in many ways during the American Revolution, and it leads us into that time period of Republican motherhood until the 1820s, in which women are responsible increasingly for raising virtuous children who will become citizens of this new republic and begin to become better educated. And all of this culminates from the 1820s to the 1950s in what historians call the cult of domesticity. And this cult of domesticity really only applies to the upper and middle class women, and it really emphasizes these new ideals of what it means to be feminine. You were supposed to have a role within the home, and that role was in relation to family and also work. A true woman was virtuous and pious and pure and submissive, and she spent her day looking for ways to please her husband and to create a happy and healthy family from within the home. Now, this stereotype could not include black women or working class women or immigrant women. It was really only for the daughters and wives of men who made up that white upper class power structure, because working class women needed to go out into the world and work in order to provide for their children. If you've ever heard someone say that being a mother or being a father is the hardest job in the world, they're actually acknowledging what's known as the hidden economy of housework. And in the 19th century, it was really women alone who were a part of this hidden economy, because they were the ones, middle-class women, who stayed home and cooked and cleaned and took care of their children. And of course today, it could be either a man or a woman who does this, but many people who go out into the world and earn wages don't look at that as work, because these people are working, but they're not actually earning any money. And so it's construed very differently than what would be considered a job outside of the home. And yet housework and child rearing carries this enormous but unacknowledged value within our society. Lydia Maria Child, who was a famous author of domesticity manuals and an abolitionist, wrote about her domestic activities in An Average Week in 1864, and she said that she made afghans and towels, pillowcases, and curtains for her home. Almost every day she cooked dinner and breakfast, she swept out the kitchen and the rest of the house, and she filled the lamps. She made extra money, as did many middle-class women, by taking on boarders, by selling kitchen fat and eggs and berries and rags. And if you look at the cost of all of this, of doing laundry and cooking meals and cleaning, it's very significant. An unmarried man who lived in a boarding house would pay $700 a year for these services, whereas most middle-class men earned only $1,000 a year. By 1850, the vast majority of homes in the settled parts of the country used stoves for both heating and cooking. Traditionalists bemoaned the loss of the blazing fireplace and questioned whether their forefathers would have fought the Revolutionary War for a hearthless homestead. And nostalgic writers claimed cooking always tasted better when it was done over a fireplace. To be sweet, nutritious, and delightful to the palate, a roast must be cooked in the open air, claimed the author of 80 Years of Progress in the United States in 1861. But coal-burning stoves definitely made life easier for the men of the house, who were beginning to have trouble finding firewood in the areas around long-settled communities. The entire family benefited from heat that actually circulated through the room, instead of simply singeing the person closest to the blaze. But the stove actually compounded the housewife's cooking chores. Women who were used to preparing dinner by hanging a single pot over the hearth now had an oven and as many as 6 or 10 plates on the top for boiling, simmering, and frying. Their families eventually came to expect 5 or 6 different dishes at dinner, and more if guests dropped by. In her recipe book, Catherine Beecher described a dinner that an American housewife might whip up for 10 to 12 people: soup, fish, a boiled ham, a boiled turkey with oyster sauce, 3 roasted ducks, scalloped oysters, potatoes, parsnips, turnips, and celery. And for dessert, pudding, pastry, fruit, and coffee. The days when a housewife could set up her kitchen with a few pans and a spit were long gone. Now there were coolers and cedars for different types of vegetables and fruits, and special kettles just for making farina or porridge. In 1850, a Philadelphia hardwoods store stocked 250 kitchen tools. Each one seemed to introduce a new species of chore. Baking was a special challenge. At a time when the egg beater and baking powder had yet to arrive on the scene, when sugar was sold in loaves, confection required an enormous amount of effort to give them volume. Take 8 eggs, yolks and whites, instructed one recipe for a basic cake. Beat and strain them and put to them a pound of sugar beaten and sifted. Beat it 3/4 of an hour together. For much of this period, women did their beating with a simple fork or a whisk. The arrival of a manual egg beater must have been cause for national rejoicing. The cast iron stove which made these recipes possible was very temperamental. Martha Coffin Wright told a correspondent that she was finishing her letter when whack went the stove, equal to a cannon, and now both windows are open to let out the smoke. Bang goes the blamed stove again. I had got all the smoke out and closed the windows and then raised the door to get the stove hot again. Before it was too hot, I shut it nearly down and it chose to puff. Stoves were hard to light, but for all their noise and smokiness, surprisingly delicate. They had to be cleaned every night and coated regularly with a black waxy polish to keep them from rusting. Many of the most genteel families felt wrestling with the stove was a servant's job. The mistress of the house was perfectly helpless when left alone in the kitchen. By the time we get to the 1830s, a few big cities had introduced gas service to residential areas. Although it was far too expensive for the majority of poor families, the affluent began putting in fixtures immediately. There was a huge transformation. With gas lights, families could sit together and read or work without straining their eyes, and there was less danger of people setting fire to themselves while reading in bed. But the brighter light made it easier to see household dirt, and things got dirty very fast in the 19th century with soot from the fireplaces and stoves, and mud that arrived from the unpaved streets. Insects swarmed in during warm weather. The window screen was another household necessity that was still waiting to be invented. So women who wanted to keep bugs off the food when they served dinner had to cover each dish. And cleanliness was a sign not only of good housekeeping but also of social status, and women became somewhat fanatic about it. The first brooms were sold commercially in 1798, and by 1840 Americans were buying 2 million of them every year. In the spring, ambitious housewives embarked on the annual big cleaning, which sometimes took a month or more. They took up the carpets and beat them, they mended the worn spots, they polished glasses. The invention of molded glass had made glassware cheap for the first time. They aired out rooms, scrubbed down floors, and dusted the books and artifacts. Nobody seemed to enjoy spring cleaning or any other part of housework very much. Everyone complained about their inept servants, and the brides of the era often had very little in the way of domestic skills. Young couples sometimes avoided housekeeping by moving into a residential hotel. And in Chicago in 1844, 1 in every 6 people listed in the city directory lived in a hotel, and another 1 in 4 in a boarding house. The other thing that changes in the 19th century is the geography of a household. If you remember, during the colonial era, it was really important for neighbors to be moral stewards to one another, and because of how close houses were up in New England, for example, and because of the craftsmanship and how you could often see inside of the homes, they often had very little privacy. And all of that really changed in the 19th century when things began to become increasingly private. Now, women who did a whole lot of work wanted to make sure in the middle class that the inside of their home was a site of consumption and not a site of production. They wanted to ensure that they were proving to the world that they were middle class. And so you see the rise of parlors that are furnished with these beautiful soft carpets and upholstered furniture and very formal paintings. And as a result of this, we're also going to see the rise of this sort of privacy in courtship, where it's no longer going to be a part of the community experience. And mothers are the ones who are going to preside over family gatherings inside of these parlors. They'll read to the children, they'll pray with the children in this room, and they'll welcome their friends and host social events, and they'll, during all of these times, create the impression that the home is a site of leisure. It's not a place of work. Now, it's clear that during the 19th century there are some very persistent inequalities, but it's also clear that this is a turning point in this discourse about gender complementarity. At least at this point, it's believed that women now have a value. And while that value may not give them the same kind of economic and political and social benefits that men have, they will eventually be able to take this concept of separate spheres and of their being in charge of morality and virtue, and they'll be able to use this to leverage movement into the public sphere. And when we see reform movements like the temperance movement and the abolitionist movement, women are going to join these because they are seizing on their prerogative as arbiters of morality and virtue. And over time, they're going to begin asking for and then demanding the right to vote. And so it's this notion of gender complementarity that's going to lead to more equality for women in the future. At this point, we're going to look sort of broadly at the concepts of sexuality and how it was practiced in Victorian America. But first, I think it's important to understand what kind of changes are happening at the turn of the century just after the American Revolution that lead to changes in concepts of sexuality and of courtship and marriage. So the first thing that you have are the growths of towns and cities as people begin to move away from the farm and couples move away from the oversight of their parents and family. And in these towns and cities, the population is so large that it's very difficult to have anyone oversee the sexuality of others in order to be sort of a moral arbiter. And you begin to have this very transient underclass in these towns and cities that will bring about the rise of more sexual deviancy as well as the rise of prostitution. You also see that after the American Revolution, this concept of enlightenment and revolutionary ideology really takes root. And it takes root both amongst women who began to petition the government in larger numbers for divorce when they're being abused by husbands, but also you see it take root in this concept of the pursuit of happiness. This idea of sexual libertinism and of seizing the day comes from this revolutionary ideology. We've already talked about some of the new scientific advancements, like the role of the egg and the sperm that change sexuality. And then we've discussed that shift in gender roles from the stereotype of a wanton seductress to a Republican mother, and finally to this cult of domesticity with a virtuous and innocent woman. But probably one of the most important things that changes sexuality in the Victorian era is the Second Great Awakening. And if you remember, the First Great Awakening was a series of religious revivals that happened in the mid-18th century. The Second Great Awakening is again a series of religious revivals, and it happens in the mid-19th century. And during this particular group of revivals, these ministers began to preach that there's no such thing as predestination, and that humans are responsible for their own fate. And women really take this to heart, and they realize that they can take responsibility for child rearing, and they don't necessarily have to have a certain number of children just because it is what would naturally have happened. And that means that there's an increased use of birth control, it brings a decrease in the size of families, and it brings about what is known as reproductive rationality. And many people today practice reproductive rationality, where you wait until you've actually decided to have a child to become pregnant, rather than seeing what the fates might bring to you. There are several shifts in marriage and courtship that occur as a result of these changes in the 19th century. And for the first time, courtship is no longer something that's done in public. It's not something for the community to be a part of, but it's something that's intensely private, where you'll have a man going and visiting a lady in her parlor. And when historians look at the letters written between courting people in this time period, it's the first time we really see them speak of love and talk about intimacy and attempt to bare their souls to one another in order to really express their deepest desires. It's also one of the first times in which average men and women could marry for love and affection, but the wealthy still had to pay attention to property and money and financial and family alliances. And there's also this new emphasis on the physical attractiveness of a mate. And while men brought financial security and stability into the marriage, women were supposed to bring their virtue and their looks into marriage. And so the pictures here represent the idea of female beauty. She should be a little bit thicker and have a large bosom, and she should have this raven, dark-colored, shiny hair that was very long, and in some cases curly. and they wanted to have the palest skin possible, so pale that you could see the green or blue veins coming through a woman's skin on her breasts, and some women would actually draw those veins in if their skin wasn't pale enough. And part of the reason for this pale skin was because it showed that you were someone of the middle or upper class, that you didn't work outside. And so during this time period, we see that premarital pregnancy rates fall from 30% to just 10% after 1830. So there's really this shift on an emphasis towards purity on the part of women. During the Victorian era, there was really a beauty standard that was nearly impossible for women to obtain without damaging their health. And everyone commented about how American women failed to exercise. At vacation resorts and country inns, all the women did was sit in rocking chairs, and they would have regarded anyone who proposed vigorous physical exercise as a madman. And there was really an excellent reason why they didn't move around more. They were completely immobilized by their clothing. Women were encased in these rigid, ribbed underwear and restricted by dresses with arms that were either long and tight or huge and full of flounces. They were also half blinded by extended bonnets and caps that eliminated all side vision and weighted down by floor-length skirts made of heavy fabrics over petticoats. And Harriet Beecher Stowe theorized that women's skirts were intended to trail along the ground as a way of demonstrating by their clean hems that the wearers never had to walk anywhere. And for a while, women wore these very stiff petticoats made from horsehair to give their skirts volume. But eventually they gave way to what were known as cages, made of hoops of increasing diameter. And over the cages, the skirts swung gracefully as their wearers walked, sometimes revealing ankles that had not been displayed for decades, and inadvertently some fancy underdrawers. And their lightness must have been a relief after the petticoats, but they were unwieldy. They got stuck in carriages and caught on fire, and even, it was alleged, blew their owners off of cliffs. Worst of all was the corset, which was worn everywhere, from the breakfast table to the ballroom, in this hopeless pursuit of an ideal 20-inch waist. Pre-adolescent girls and older women, and even mothers-to-be in the advanced stages of their pregnancy, wore them. These women defined themselves as members of the leisure class, as wives and daughters who were so well taken care of, they didn't even have to take a deep breath. But the Industrial Revolution made them affordable to almost everyone, and suddenly factory girls and servants began to wear them as tight as their occupation allowed. And young women of courting age were laced to rib-cracking tightness. One commentator claimed it was not unusual to see a mother lay her daughter down upon the carpet, put a foot on her back, and break half a dozen laces in tightening her stays. Comparisons to Chinese foot binding were rife, and stories were passed around about deformed babies born with corset lines imprinted into their flesh. Almost every clergyman, doctor, and magazine editor decried this custom of tight corsetry. In an age when medical experts found everything from education to meat eating dangerous to the delicate female sensibility, the corset was blamed both for problems it really did cause, like shortness of breath and miscarriages, and those that it didn't, like curvature of the spine and cancer. While virtually everything women read told them that these were bad, everything they saw stressed how essential they were. Magazines pictured women with tiny waists and dresses that sported long, tight sleeves, heavy fabric, and huge skirts. Fathers sometimes urged their daughters to consider their health before appearance, but mothers often sided with the forces of fashion. This was one of many eras in American history when young women were at war with their bodies. We in America have got so far out of the way of womanhood that has any vigor of outline or opulence of physical proportion that when we see a woman made as a woman ought to be, she strikes us as a monster, wrote Harriet Beecher Stowe. Our willowy girls are afraid of nothing so much as growing stout. Girls starved themselves to win the ultimate compliment of fairy-like. Warm clothing was not fairy-like, and fashionable women wore only shawls for protection in the winter. Although shoemakers were finally learning how to differentiate between left and right feet, women of fashion didn't seem to make fit a priority. They never wear muffs or boots and appear extremely shocked at the sight of comfortable walking shoes and cotton stockings, wrote Frances Trollope. Tan skin was also unacceptable. especially in the South. Remember not to go out without your bonnet because it will make you very ugly. And then we should not love you so much, wrote Thomas Jefferson, demonstrating once again that he could always find just the wrong thing to say to his devoted daughter. Everybody talked about fashion reform, but anyone who actually tried it ran the risk of universal ridicule. Elizabeth Cady Stanton fell in love with what would come to be known as the bloomer dress, a short skirt over very full Turkish-style trousers. It was invented by Amelia Bloomer. But Stanton found, as did many of her friends, that no amount of comfort was worth constantly being jeered at by little boys on the streets, snubbed by old acquaintances, and hollered at by male authority figures. No matter how you got around it, the things on bloomer wearers' legs were a form of pants, and critics cited Deuteronomy's prohibition of cross-dressing, claiming that the Bible was anti-bloomer. The dress reformers fought on for some time, but even the health journals had correspondents who wrote in arguing that when ridicule became overwhelming, it was time to abandon dress reform. Perhaps the bloomers would have done better if they had been more flattering. Cady Stanton, whose figure was by no means fairy-like, admitted the outfit really required a perfection of form, limb, and feet, such as few possessed. It's really important to remember that with all of these changes in courtship and the beauty standard and gender stereotypes, as well as the expectations of women and men's roles within marriage, there is a change in the reality of marriage as well. Marriage allowed working class men and women to pool their financial resources, and this was a time period much like today when it was very difficult to get by on just one person's wages. So this was a really big deal, and it helped people to survive in a fairly difficult economic climate. But at the same time, this persistent sexual double standard made this goal of love and reciprocity, which was really the ultimate aim of marriage, very difficult for married couples. While in courtship they may have exposed their souls to one another, usually within a couple of years of being married, there began to be issues within the marriage. And some of this could have come from financial issues or from this unequal distribution of resources in the marriage. Others may have had problems as a result of prostitution, which we're going to talk about this huge expansion in prostitution in the cities especially, which led to a rise in rates of venereal disease and many unhappy wives ending up with STDs that they didn't know anything about. And it's important to remember, too, that there were plenty of happily married couples in this time period, but even those who were happily married were occasionally tripped up by this very difficult reality within their marriage, that men and women had very different expectations placed upon them and very different access to the resources within their society. In the 1970s, a family unearthed a series of papers that were yellowed with age and covered with dust in their attic, and it turned out that these papers were actually the key to really understanding the sexuality of men and women in the Victorian era. Because these papers were a series of surveys that had been given by a female physician named Cecilia D. Mosher, and they're known collectively as the Mosher surveys. So she gave out these surveys to many of her middle-class female patients and asked them about their marriages and about their sexual lives and their sexual intimacy with their husbands. And so we now have this small sampling of middle-class married women's sexual histories as a result of this. And what we've found from these documents is that most women were still frightened and uneducated about sex on their wedding night. Because while men received a good deal of sexual education and very few of them were still virgins upon marriage, women knew almost nothing about sexuality or even about their own bodies on their wedding night, and so it must have been a very scary experience for them. We also found in these surveys that many women found sex to be painful, they found it to be a tiresome chore, but they did believe that it was necessary to a happy marriage. And few of them had it more than a couple of times a month because doctors in this time period taught women that if they had too much intercourse that they could actually damage their womb. And so one of the reasons that men will say that they turn to prostitution is because they didn't want to damage the health of their lovely wives. Now, there is a growing number of women, and I think it's notable that these women in these surveys actually found that sex fostered intimacy between themselves and their husbands, and amongst this growing number, they found their sex lives pleasing and even enjoyable. And as we move out of the 19th century and into the 20th century, that number is going to continue to increase.